Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Hello, Strictly Facts family. Welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture with me, Alexandria, bringing you yet another riveting conversation on Caribbean history. We had a great discussion some time ago talking about Puerto Rico as a U.S. colony and the decades upon decades or even centuries long years of activism really on behalf of Puerto Ricans who want independence from the U.S. and, that sort of story. But in today's episode, we're approaching that conversation from a different angle, really focusing on Puerto Rico from the perspective of the long history of U.S. legal decisions that have allowed for Puerto Rico to not only remain a colony, but also face some of the systemic issues it has, especially of late, with natural disasters and things to that nature. So joining me for this episode is Dr. Mónica Jiménez, Assistant Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. Our topic today really falls in line with Dr. Jiménez's upcoming book, Making Never Neverland, Race and Law in the Creation of Puerto Rico, which is due out by the University of North Carolina Press in June. So, Dr. Jiménez, thank you so much for being on this episode with me. Why don't we start with you telling our listeners a bit about yourself, your connection to the region, and what's inspired your research looking at law, colonialism, and race, of course, in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you so much, Alexandria, for having me on your podcast today. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm super excited to talk to you about this. I have been working on this book in some form or fashion since I was a law student at the University of Texas. So to see it sort of come to fruition is really, really meaningful for me. So I am from Puerto Rico. I'm from Ponce. My family moved to Houston, Texas when I was a child. And so I grew up in the Houston area, going back and forth between Puerto Rico and the US mainland at a time when there were very few Puerto Ricans in Houston. So I like to say we were kind of a first wave of Puerto Ricans that moved to the Houston area to work in the petrochemical industry. And so my family was a part of a very small migration that happened in the mid 80s from mostly the southern coast of Puerto Rico, the Caribbean coast, in pursuit of that industry, which had been present in Puerto Rico and kind of shut down in the mid 80s as a result of the end of some of the tax incentives that had drawn the industry to Puerto Rico in the first place, and which I talk a little bit about in the book. So, grew up in that pretty typical kind of Caribbean migrant feeling of being from here and from there and not from here and not from there, right? El vaivén of like back and forthness. And I think in some ways that's always motivated my questions about Puerto Rico, certainly, and about the Caribbean and about migration. And especially growing up in the Southwest, where migration and migrants are sort of a fact of life and have always been a fact of life. That's always been a question, right? Why do people move and how and what are their experiences when they're moving? And I think because of my own, family's migration at a young age for me, that was always a kind of background question. So I went to law school really wanting to know more about Puerto Rico, which seems ironic that you would go to law school at the University of Texas, right? And not, I don't know, somewhere else in the Northeast, for example. But I just had something that I was questioning, and I couldn't quite tell you at the time what it was. I just knew that like understanding the law was going to help me understand something about Puerto Rico that I couldn't understand otherwise. So that's why I went to law school. And in my second year of law school, third year, I took a seminar that was this cool class. It was all about democracy and accountability and the rule of law. Really, mostly focused on Latin America at a time when truth and reconciliation committees were really sort of taking off. And there was this real question about accountability to the citizenry, especially for atrocities in the past, right? The dictatorship in Chile, these kinds of large social justice questions. And for me, what came to mind is how, if ever, is the US government accountable to Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, given that the citizens in Puerto Rico don't have representation in the federal government? So that was really, for me, the motivating question, right? And I remember going to my professor, who was an expert in NAFTA law and in kind of trade law between the U.S. and Central America. And I go to her and I say to her, this is a question that I have, and I think the kind of research paper that I want to do is about the federal death penalty in Puerto Rico. So really thinking about, why is it acceptable to impose a federal death penalty in Puerto Rico, given that Puerto Ricans lack representation and that it is explicitly barred in the local constitution, right, the Puerto Rico constitution, which is not unlike some states. However, that question of accountability is different, right, for Puerto Rico, because of this lack of representation. So I felt like there was something there, and something that merited investigation. And my professor was incredibly dismissive of it. And she just was like, how is Puerto Rico different from the 50 states? Why does this matter? And really, really pissed me off, to be quite frank, right? She really just, it made me really angry, because I was like, how can you be an expert in Latin America and not know that this is a live and urgent question? And so, in some ways I have her to thank, because she's the motivation for what has become this book, and kind of my life's work, right? And also for my understanding that this has to be explained and explained and re-explained. And as you said, we've been explaining it for decades and over a century, and yet it's still, it still needs explanation, which is of course very frustrating, but also, it's sort of become my life's mission, right? Is like, this is the work that I've signed up to do. So the book is really grew out of those questions that I was first asking as a second year law student, that seemed to be dismissed, right? That people just were like, this doesn't matter. This isn't interesting. These are not the questions you should be asking, right? And is Puerto Rico even Latin America, right? That was the other like underlying. So yeah, so that's where I'm coming from. As a long way of saying that's where I come from geographically, and that's kind of where I'm coming from intellectually.
It's always funny to me how many people don't necessarily realize that they were spiteful inspirations for our work sometimes, because I definitely have some of those stories. But I think when we think about things full circle, it's definitely more so for the benefit of our people and the region, the diaspora especially. So I'm really excited to read your book when it comes out in June. And hopefully, this brief intro will definitely inspire a lot of our listeners to definitely check it out next year when it comes out as well. And so I know that, there are different ways of classifying Puerto Rico. We've said it's a colony. Obviously, your professor had asked, how is it not different from the 50 states? And it definitely is, want to make that obviously clear. But in a political sense and legal sense, it is defined as an insular or unincorporated territory, right? We can call it a colony, of course, but that is the legal framing. It's how the US defines it. And so, as a way to sort of dive into our conversation today, describe what that insular unincorporated territory means and how that really has set the stage for Puerto Rico's political relations with the US.
Yes, absolutely. So you're right. Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory, and it has been that since 1901. That's when that designation was created for Puerto Rico specifically. Though of course Guam carries that designation as well, and so do the U.S. Virgin Islands. So the notion of the unincorporated territory is really what we call a legal fiction, right? This is a moment of kind of creating this thing out of, in some ways, out of nothing. There is no unincorporated territory in the U.S. Constitution, right? There wasn't an unincorporated territory in the U.S. sort of legal precedent, in the U.S. legal canon before 1901. And so this was sort of created as a way of distinguishing Puerto Rico and the other insular territories, the other islands that were acquired, islands and archipelagos, right? Acquired by the US government after the War of 1898 with Spain and the Philippines, Cuba, right? And so that moment created this kind of question mark for the US, for the US government, as a kind of governmental entity, but also for Americans, right? So I like to sort of highlight for my students, especially when I teach this, that this was kind of a morally defining moment for the US, where the US populace was kind of asking themselves, wait a minute, are we going to be a colonial master? Like, weren't we as a government, as a nation, right? Isn't our history one of uh, breaking free of colonialism, right? And so, what does it mean for us as a nation, for our sort of national view of ourselves, right? If we become a colonial master. And so there are, of course, famously, Rudyard Kipling's "The White Man's Burden" was written in response to this querying, right, the U.S. populace was doing, and it's Kipling's sort of calling for the U.S. government and patriots to take up the burden of colonialism, right, to sort of walk into their rightful duty of becoming colonial masters, in the face of this sort of uncertainty. And I say uncertainty because there was a lot of debate, but also, a very clear notion within the US government that we want to retain these territories, right? We might not want to be called an empire and we might not want to be called colonial masters, but we want and we feel like we should and are also like it's our right to expand in this way. And of course, the major prize in that conflict was the Philippines, right? The sort of opening up of the East to and Asia to the U.S., right? Which at the time Britain had a lock on that region, and so the U.S. really wanted entry. So the Philippines, and then Cuba. Cuba was the other prize, right? Largest of the islands of the Caribbean, most sort of lucrative sugar exporter at that time in the Caribbean. And Puerto Rico, to a lesser extent, was sort of a okay, sure, we'll take it, right? It becomes strategically very important, and there was already a kind of view to like militarily, geographically, Puerto Rico would provide some cover for the Panama Canal, which was already kind of in mind to be created. So again, right, thinking kind of strategically, how do we keep these territories under our control, reap the economic benefits, right, be able to sort of exploit the economic possibilities within them, but also contend with our own legal system, right? And the fact that the US had never expanded overseas, right? And so this unincorporated territory was a creation of this moment as a way to allow the United States to retain the islands and archipelagos that it had acquired, but without extending the protections of the Constitution, right? Without at the time granting citizenship to the people who lived in these places, or really full rights, right? It was a kind of like wait and see, right? Like what is going to develop in these places, and it allowed for that kind of flexibility of the US government to say, okay, we're allowed to kind of expand here and we can kind of start our colonial project, and we don't have to kind of fulfill all of the duties of the Constitution in these places, which of course then allows for the US government to behave in ways that it would not necessarily be able to behave like in the states, right? If people don't have all of the rights of the Constitution, right, then you can sort of engage differently than you can in a place where the Constitution applies fully. So that was the kind of solution in 1901.
As we're moving temporally, while Puerto Ricans eventually do get US citizenship, there are still several rights that they don't have. For instance, not being able to vote in presidential elections, not being able to elect their own senators and representatives to Congress, several other things, right? And so just wanting to sort of uplift that point as well, as we are getting into this conversation about colonialism and US law in particular. One thing that I really find, um, I don't wanna say interesting, but, in the sense of, thinking in retrospect how this sort of term, the unincorporated territory, was really used and planned to just sort of be a catch for all, I guess, in a sense in the 20th century, not even really understanding, um, the implications for Puerto Rico were more than a century later, right? It is, though, steeped in this long history of US law that really has been based on race, on other similar practices that may not necessarily be defined as colonialism, but are definitely in the same shape of, white supremacy, racial hierarchies, and these other things, especially in the 19th and 20th century. And so especially I'm thinking here Dred Scott, which I know obviously comes up in your work especially, but could you share briefly that sort of like lineage of cases, that trajectory of what some of those legal decisions are and how they created what you title in your book states of exception, and then, how Puerto Rico also fits into that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question and that reminder, right? So, what I didn't say is that the unincorporated territory, the legal fiction, the category is created because of the people who live in the insular territories, right? So it's not just, oh, these places are far away and we don't want to sort of make them part of the U.S. because that's what the unincorporated territory did, right? It maintained it as something belonging to the U.S. but not a part of the U.S. And the reason for that categorization is because the people who lived in those places were Black and Asian and mixed race, right? And spoke different languages, and were not Protestant, right? They were Catholics by and large. But, in the case of Guam, there were indigenous Guamese Chamorro peoples, right? And in the case of the Philippines, right? So these people are others, and we have to treat them as other. And so the unincorporated territory was a means to do that. And so in the book, the first part of the book is called Toward a Legal Genealogy of Racial Exclusion. And it's really thinking about Puerto Rico sitting within a legal genealogy, and one that is concerned with how to create spaces of exclusion for racial others, or as I call it in the book, racial undesirables, right? These groups of people that the US government really would rather not incorporate, would rather not extend full rights to. And of course, the first of those peoples are Native Americans, right? So the book begins with an exploration of the Marshall Trilogy, which is a group of legal cases, three legal cases decided fairly early in the American sort of republic under the leadership of the Supreme Court of Justice Marshall. And this is a moment when the Supreme Court is kind of carving out a role for itself. And one of the things that sort of early rises up, right? Questions that come up is, well, how is the US government sort of contending with Native American rights, right? Native American sovereignty, Native American claims to land. What's going to be the relationship? And that's what these cases sort of do. They're the first sort of explorations of the court trying to carve out a role for itself and really delineate how the US is going to treat Native Americans and Native American sovereignty in particular. And so the cases, they're fascinating, fascinating cases, as you might imagine, and also enraging, as you also could imagine, right? But what collectively they stand for, this notion that Congress has plenary power over Native affairs, and so they have absolute power, and also that the decisions of Congress with respect to Native Americans are really not subject to judicial review. So that it carves out a really large power for Congress over Native affairs. And so these three cases are sort of the bedrock of Indian law. Other cases stem from it and sort of have tried to nuance it. But generally, scholars understand that what these cases did was set up this very large power that the federal government has over Native affairs, and very, very much limited Native sovereignty, right, and Native title, and basically Native power. So I really look at that in part for a couple of reasons. One, because they're cited in these early legal precedents that create the unincorporated territory. And in particular, this one case, Downs v. Bidwell, which is the sort of infamous case that creates the category of unincorporated territory. It's where you get that sort of famous phrase, foreign in a domestic sense, with respect to Puerto Rico. And in that case, you see the Supreme Court sort of, I like to describe it as tying themselves in knots to try to maintain Puerto Rico and the other insular territories as something not a part of the US, but at that point, kind of trying to reach for like, well, how do we do this? Because it's clear that those precedents aren't there, right? So we have to kind of try to reach for these legal arguments and kind of make something out of nothing in order to make this notion of an unincorporated territory happen. And they call on the Marshall Trilogy, and they cite to it, and they use it as a way of talking about the American empire, right? And the fact that the U.S. has a right, there is a right to an American empire, and also for these sorts of propositions about plenary power and sort of power that Congress has over territory. So I start the book with those cases, and the comparison between the unincorporated territories and native reservations, native sovereignty, have been made for years by legal scholars and historians. So that's not new necessarily. But I always think it merits a real sort of close read. And so part of what I think is the kind of innovation of the book is that it really tries to be very careful about close reading these cases together. So beginning with the Marshall trilogy, and then from there it goes to a discussion of Dred Scott v. Sanford, which is a case that again is also very closely linked to Downs v. Bidwell, but too few scholars make the connection, right? So I think again another innovation of the book is close reading these cases collectively and also being very concerted about tying the legal relationship that Puerto Rico has with the United States with that came before of Black Americans, right? And really thinking about the way that Black exclusion made way for Puerto Rico's exclusion, right? Which I see too few scholars doing that work, right? Really thinking about collectively about these kinds of cases as a way of thinking about the way that race has always played a role in this type of exclusionary legal mechanism. And so Dred Scott is also a precedent that is cited in Downs v. Bidwell. And it is most known, of course, in our history of ignominious legal cases, right, as this place where Justice Taney famously said that blacks, this is a quote, right, blacks have no rights that the white man is meant to respect, and that they must lawfully be reduced to slavery. And so the other sort of part of that case that we talk about less is about territoriality, right? So there was the question of Black American rights, right? Like was Dred Scott a citizen? That was one of the questions that was being asked, and the court decides no, he's not a citizen, and he can never be a citizen because the Constitution basically was not made for him. That's one part of the case. The other part of the case is about the application of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in the territories, and that's the part that's most relevant to Puerto Rico's early 19th century history, right? That is cited in this Downs case. In Dred Scott, the court is again sort of grappling with creating something that doesn't exactly exist, but because it's so interested in maintaining one, Black exclusion, and two, insisting that the Missouri Compromise, which banned slavery in the territories, was unconstitutional. Right. So there you really see Taney in particular wants this outcome. He wants to be able to say that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional and that slavery cannot be banned in the territories. And so you see him sort of create this decision, right? And it's why the decision was so reviled, because it was so clear to people that he and the other justices that agreed with him were just sort of twisting things to get the outcome that they wanted. But what he does say in there, lost in all of that, right, hate and terribleness, is what he says is actually about Congress's plenary power in the territories and westward expansion, which was that Congress could not acquire territory to hold it indefinitely. It had to be acquired to be put on a path to statehood. So that part of the decision, of course, gets lost because it's not what we remember, right? We remember, of course, the exclusion, right, and the kind of the pronouncements on slavery. But what he does lay out is this kind of doctrine about how the U.S. is going to go about expanding and acquiring territories. And he also says that the Bill of Rights will apply in the territories. That's kind of a no-brainer. The Bill of Rights applies, and when such time as the territory is ready, it will be admitted as a state. We can understand that when the territory is ready meant white settlement, right? That they're sort of opening up the possibility that, and this says so specifically in the case, like, these lands are mostly occupied by like random bands, and this is again, these are quotes, random bands of Indians, right? So basically, when enough white settlement is present in the territories, then the state will be ready to enter the US. That's the part that troubled the court in 1901 with Downs v. Bidwell. Because if we have to make all territory that we acquire a state, then that means these territories that we've just acquired in 1898 have to also get the Bill of Rights extended to them. They have to get the Constitution extended to them, and they must be put on a path to statehood. And those three things are things that people did not want to do and the US government did not want to do in the early 20th century, right? They did not want to make these people a part of the US. They did not want to extend full rights to them. And they wanted a way to not be forced to make these territories states. Hence, the unincorporated territory is born. But you can really trace the kind of logics that allow for it back through Dred Scott and the Marshall Trilogy and what I call the American state of exception, the kind of reading of the Constitution as allowing for these spaces where rights either do not exist in the case of native reservations or plantations, right, or exist in very, very limited ways. And that's the argument of the book, that through this legal history, we can see how Puerto Rico in the early 20th century then is made into another one of these lacunae of law. Um, and then the second half of the book is asking, well, what happens in the lacunae, right? Now that they've made this space, what is it possible in that space?
You know, many of our listeners might be familiar with things. I remember learning about Margaret Sanger and birth control, and then not necessarily when I first heard about it, but down the line in my studies, learning that birth control was initially tested in Puerto Rico, leaving countless women, sterilized and all of these things. There is a moment in that 20th century post this decision where Puerto Rico just kind of becomes a hotbed for testing and just exploration in a way that legally couldn't have been done for the US states, right? Because of this status as an unincorporated territory. And so could you share a little bit about this post Downs v. Bidwell moment, and just really clarify what the decision allowed for in the immediate aftermath?
Sure. I like to start with this moment in 1900 where Puerto Rico experiences what at that point and really until Hurricane Maria was the worst hurricane the archipelago had ever experienced, which was Hurricane San Siriaco. And this hurricane sort of followed a very similar trajectory to Hurricane Maria, kind of plowed through the middle of the archipelago through the central mountain region, devastated the central mountain region, which at the time was where the coffee plantations were. And again, before the US sort of really gets its sort of economic engine going in Puerto Rico, coffee was the primary export crop. So this is at a time when coffee is still very important. And so coffee is devastated. Many, many people lose their lives. Several thousand people lose their lives. Hundreds of thousands of people are displaced. And so there's this great story of this military doctor named Bailey K. Ashford. And if you've ever been to San Juan, the main road that runs through El Condado part of San Juan, which is like the ritzy area where all the hotels are and the nightlife is, that street is called Ashford and it's named for Bailey K. Ashford. There's also, I think, a hospital that still bears his name. So, very important sort of historical figure. And so he's this military doctor stationed in Ponce, Puerto Rico. And after the hurricane, sort of people start coming down from the mountains, people who are like homeless now, right? And looking for help. And many of them are rural peasants who had worked in the coffee plantations. And Ashford writes in his journal, he starts sort of seeing these folks, and he's like, they all looked really like sickly and malnutritioned. And he's like, why? They have anemia. Why do they have anemia? Like, oh, so many Puerto Ricans have anemia. And so he starts ordering his people to feed these folks that are arriving, feed them meat, feed them like red meat, and a very sort of American diet, right? Like a meat and potatoes type of diet. And he's like, they need iron. They're all sick. And like they get sicker, right? They start like vomiting, right? Like this meat that he's giving them and this like American fare is not sitting well with them and they are getting sicker. And instead they're like, please give us what we normally eat, rice and beans and codfish. That's what we eat. That's good for us. Give it to us. And so of course he's writing with disdain, like, oh, I had to give them what they wanted, right? They were clamoring for the salted codfish. And when I gave it to them, they all started purring like kittens. He writes this in his journal, right? But they didn't get any better, right? And so he is very frustrated, and that's clear in his memoir or his biography that these folks, their health is not improving, and he can't figure out why. And so after a time, and many of them are dying, he starts experimenting on them. And he starts sort of taking their feces, and he starts taking their blood, and he starts taking their urine, and, just like whatever. He's performing medical experiments on them. Um, and he realizes that the reason that they're sick is not because they have anemia, or they do have anemia, but the reason they have anemia is because they all suffer from hookworm infestation. And hookworm was a disease that was rampant in the US South, all over the Caribbean, Latin America, and Asia. And it was a question of poor sanitation and shoelessness, right? So rural peasants who didn't wear shoes, or only wore shoes on limited occasions when they had to like dress nicely, right? They were walking around barefoot and they were getting hookworm, which hooks onto the bottom of your feet, enters the body through the feet. And so he comes to this and he starts kind of thinking like, oh, how do I cure this? And he creates all these different purges and elixirs and medical concoctions. And he is giving it to these folks and sort of seeing how they respond. And in that process, he does come up with a cure for hookworm, which is why he's so important, right? Why his name persists, is he is responsible for curing hookworm, and the experiments that led to those discoveries in Puerto Rico are then exported all over the world. And he gets funding from the Rockefeller Foundation. And they help found what becomes the Institute of Tropical Medicine, which is basically the first of the University of Puerto Rico medical school. And those experiments literally are sent all over the world, to India, to Brazil, to parts of the US South, all over the US empire. And the impulse, right, to experiment with these folks, it comes from a place of like, oh, I want to solve a problem. These folks need medical intervention, right? I'm assuming, and he doesn't tell us that he's asking them for consent. And this is a time when most doctors in this position would not be asking for consent, right? So I think it's a very fair and safe historical assumption to make, right? That he was not acquiring consent from these patients before he was performing these experiments. And so, even though the overall good of resolving and knowing why they were sick and solving the problem of infestation worldwide is absolutely a medical good. The way that we get there is by literally experimenting on people's bodies, Puerto Ricans' bodies, right? And we know through the history of US medical experimentation, certainly on Black women's bodies, and Black men's bodies, and just the marginalized peoples in general, right? That is a very fraught sort of history. So it begins, the kind of tropical medicine in that way begins in Puerto Rico in that moment of experimentation. And I like that vignette because I think it speaks to a colonial mindset, right? That would concern itself very little with the people that are involved in the experiments and be much more concerned with the sort of outcome, right? And be able to justify whatever came in between with the outcome, right? And so that kind of period sees these sorts of medical experimentations, which you also mentioned, the birth control experiments, which begin early, right? The kind of women's sterilization that we are very familiar with from especially the documentary La Operación, right? Which is probably the most kind of visceral telling of that story. Excellent documentary that focuses on the kind of 1960s, 1970s moment, but this begins very early on. And so we know that history. Um, I learned when I was in grad school, and I found that fascinating too, that Agent Orange was first tested in Puerto Rico as well, right? In El Yunque, in the rainforest. So a history of using these technologies of, birth control technologies and sterilization technologies, but also, weaponry, right? And of course, the US's sort of military campaigns all over Puerto Rico, in particular in Vieques and Culebra, are also well known, right? The experimenting with military technologies. So, my argument is that the Downs and the creation of this unincorporated territory facilitates Puerto Rico's becoming an experimental station at large, right? So, the experimental stations that were created in that early 20th century moment dealt with really everything, right? There was like experimental stations that dealt with nutrition, where they tried to sort of figure out what kind of nutrition was best suited, right? So how to get more milk, for example, into children in Puerto Rico, and they would set up these little stations in the rural areas where women could come, especially mothers who had children, right, could come and get milk for their children. so that kind of thing was like milk was not that it wasn't available in Puerto Rico, but it wasn't something that everyone had access to, and it wasn't a part of the diet, right? So these sort of processes of, in part, bringing U.S. commodities to Puerto Rico, food commodities, and other technologies, to try to facilitate a consumer, right? Consumer in all these different kinds of ways, as well as experimenting with agriculture and with military technologies and medical technologies, public health technologies, right? All of these sorts of um, projects that then could be put to use in other places, right? And Puerto Rico does become a kind of showcase for the U.S. in the Americas, right? It can say, "Look what we've done in Puerto Rico. This kind of agricultural technology works in Puerto Rico. It could work in Colombia, or it could work in wherever, right?" And that's documented as well. That these experiments, in some ways, facilitate an attempt by the U.S. government to kind of be more involved in Latin America, right? Or have a sort of an alternative entry point. And so for me, to my kind of reading of it, Downs makes way for this, right? This is a kind of part and parcel colonial impulse to experiment, to remake, right? To redesign society. So the kind of milk goes to that. I think the nutrition goes to that, right? Like we are going to reorient these people's diet, because we think it's better, right? That they have milk and dairy and red meat and whatever, but also because then they'll buy it from us, right? And we will sell it to them, and we'll kind of create the market that we need for these things too. So there's always this dual purpose, right? On the one hand, it's like, oh, these poor folks, don't they need help, right? We should educate them. We should help them. They're sick. We need to cure their sickness. But also, if we create the society that we want, then we can sell it what we want. We can also put it to work in the ways that we want. So one of the points that I make in the book is that curing hookworm and creating a healthy society also meant creating a healthy workforce, right? So it wasn't just like, oh, these people are sick and they need to be healthy. It's like, yes, they are sick, and we need them to be healthy so that they can work. Because if they're sick and weak, they can't cut cane in the ways that we need them to, right? And to me, to my reading, to my like thinking, it's really Downs. It's the gateway to this kind of reorientation.
And to that point, creating this workforce, as you mentioned, creating this population of people who, to our earlier point, right, still are not getting all of the basic human rights as outlined in the US Constitution. So the US government will allow for them to, be cured of hookworm and, here's the milk and the potatoes and the red meat. But you're not full US citizens at that time, but also, as we go on through time, are not able to vote for your own members of Congress and all of these more problematic lines that I think really showcase the bedrock of colonialism, right? The US government and the legal system allowing to pick and choose really what they are going to bestow upon you while also still being allowed to extract so many resources and really glorify their abilities in the world, right? To be able to do certain things all based off the experimentation and the abuses of colonialism. You bring up Hurricane Maria, of course, right? I don't think we can have a conversation about Puerto Rico, especially one that goes into more contemporary times without really analyzing that. You know, the challenges of Hurricane Maria and its aftermath also, as you point to, stemming toward this longer history of racial exclusion, of the challenges of being an unincorporated territory. And so as we contend with, President Puerto Rico and really understanding its issues, whether that's, Public Law 600 and all of the slew of legal decisions that really thwart the rights of Puerto Rican citizens, while many of our listeners might be more familiar with some of those recent challenges, like the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, could you share, especially related to natural disasters, what have been some of the challenges in the 21st century to Puerto Rico's legal status, especially in its relations with the US?
Yeah. So one of the I think the key things to remember. And so you point rightly that, our Puerto Rico citizenship status changes, right? Its sort of legal designation in some ways changes, right? In the mid 20th century, Puerto Rico becomes the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the Estado Libre Asociado, which, there are many, many books written about the ELA, the Estado Libre Asociado, the ELA for short. And I have a whole chapter on it where I'm really asking the question, what was this thing, right? What was this moment in the mid 20th century? What was it making? What did it do? And there was a real question then about whether the ELA was really decolonizing Puerto Rico, right? And I say this in scare quotes, right? Like, was it decolonizing Puerto Rico? Because there were arguments that it was, right. The proponents of the ELA were really sort of pushing that this was decolonization because Puerto Rico was getting a local government, and the ability to sort of elect its own leaders, its own local leaders, and its own governor, and really sort of creating some local autonomy, right? So autonomy was the big buzzword. And of course, the mid 20th century is the kind of moment of self determination, right? I like to situate Puerto Rico's moment of creating the ELA within a larger sort of post World War II moment where the global South is decolonizing, right? Other parts of the Caribbean quickly follow. Parts of Africa and Asia are decolonizing, right? So this is a moment where post World War II, the kind of global reorientation of the world, and it's aligning along sort of, communist USSR and liberal democracy, the U.S. And so this is the moment that the ELA is created, and the language and the rhetoric of self determination, of autonomy become very important, right? And I argue that they are sort of abused, right, misused and abused, as a way of obfuscating what was really happening when the ELA was created, which was that Puerto Rico was getting a local government, but that Downs v. Bidwell and the unincorporated territory were not being addressed at all. And they tried. The framers of the Puerto Rico Constitution, who were essentially those who lobbied and sort of um, negotiated for the ELA in Congress, some of them did try to push that unincorporated category would be changed, right? That Puerto Rico would either be incorporated or that something was changing. And Congress was very clear that they were not willing to make those changes, right? That their plenary power had to remain in place. That Puerto Rico would be allowed to sort of create this local government, but that plenary power, i.e., the power that Congress has over Puerto Rico, would not be displaced. And so, if that power is not displaced, then Puerto Rico remains a colony. And if it's not overturned, right, if Downs isn't overturned, then Puerto Rico remains an unincorporated territory. So, then the question was, well, then what did the ELA do, right? It did allow for a local government, and it allowed for, that local government to pass laws that facilitated the industrialization of Puerto Rico, and with it, the sort of creation of jobs of Puerto Rico. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, when I was talking about my family, that industrialization, that modernization, that sort of moving out of rural poverty and into a kind of industrialized, middle class wealth, liberal wealth, was premised on tax exemptions. It was premised on inviting rich corporations to set up shop in Puerto Rico, bring their industry, and then let Puerto Rico provide cheap labor, right? And that is how the Puerto Rican economy was funded for the latter half of the 20th century. Those tax incentives were sort of codified in U.S. tax law, and in the 1990s they were basically rolled back. And when they were rolled back, there was like a 10-year phase out. And they were like, okay, in 10 years, the last of the tax exemptions will be done. And that phase out deadline was 2006. And what we see is that when that happens, the Puerto Rican economy sort of craters. And the thinking was, we'll give it a 10-year phase out for other things to be put into place, other policies, ways of attracting business. But that didn't happen. And so what we saw was business fleeing, right? Those businesses that were losing their tax exemptions, then finding that they could go to, Asia and other parts of Latin America for cheaper labor. Many of them literally went from Puerto Rico to the Dominican Republic, just right across the strait, right? Because it was cheaper to go there. and nothing coming and replacing it, right? So that when Puerto Rico enters the sort of Great Recession that we experienced in the U.S. mainland, its economy was already in a recession, and so that recession was even more devastating for Puerto Rico than it was for us. And that's where you see the kind of beginning of what we now know was a sort of debt catastrophe, right? And the other sort of key part of this weird little all the many quirks that exist in Puerto Rico. And again, you can sort of relate this back to the unincorporated territory, is that the kind of regulatory controls that exist for banks and financial institutions in the United States mainland don't apply in Puerto Rico. So that banks operating in Puerto Rico could offer crazy kind of deals, crazy incentives, crazy kind of negotiations and clauses in loans that we would not have been able to see in the US, right? There were sort of bankers who saw it as a kind of frontier, right? You can kind of experiment again, financial experimentation happening in Puerto Rico. And again, because at some point Congress decided, the SEC and the kind of federal regulations that control banks, for some reason, they don't have to apply in Puerto Rico. That's one of the powers that Congress maintains, right, with its plenary power and the fact that Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory, is that it gets to decide which provisions of the US laws will apply to Puerto Rico and which do not. And they only have to have a rational basis for excluding Puerto Rico. And if Congress can kind of have what seems like a rational reason, then the US Supreme Court will uphold that. So, anyways, that's what's happening as Puerto Rico enters the 21st century and how we are still seeing the ramifications. Just one example, but a huge one, right? Because we have seen what the debt crisis has caused in Puerto Rico. And that, is the 21st century legacy of essentially a 19th century legal decision, right? Because even though it's happening in 1901, right, the kind of mentality of it, the ethics of it, the legal reasoning of it is sort of that late 19th century, social Darwinian, manifest destiny, white supremacist notion. And even though, and one of the points that I make in the book is that, we reject that thinking now, right? We reject this kind of racist sort of underpinnings of our laws. We rejected Dred Scott and we eventually rejected, Plessy v. Ferguson and separate but equal. But that law from 1901 continues to be the reason that Puerto Rico can be treated differently. And you cannot sort of disentangle the racism that was built into that law and that case. Even if we say, well, it's a rational basis, Congress has a rational basis, like, money is always a rational basis. You can always justify anything with, like, oh, it costs too much to do that in Puerto Rico, or Puerto Ricans, quote unquote, don't pay federal taxes. So it's justified that we exclude them, right? But if we want to really think about where the birth of the exclusion comes from, it's always this racist case from 1901, where Puerto Ricans are seen as not capable, as too Catholic, too Black, too brown, as quote unquote mongrels, right? Because that was a common designation of the day, right? Like, these folks are mongrels. So that's the point, is that this decision continues to significantly impact what is possible for Puerto Ricans and how they relate to the United States.
And I think in that point, even, provides further evidence for the US's response in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, for instance, right? In the way that if it was a state, perhaps the US government would have responded much more quickly. The length of time that Puerto Rico spent in darkness, the flooding, just the exacerbating conditions that they really faced and have continued to face since are in part due to this understanding of Puerto Rico as an unincorporated territory as opposed to a state of the United States.
I just was going to add that with that, I think what is important is there's the like legal categorization, but then what that sort of signals to a US populace as well, right? Because part of it still, even all of this time later, is this question of, well, is Puerto Rico even the US? Should we, taxpayers here in the US, be funding aid to these people over there, right? And that was a point that Donald Trump pushed heavily on, right? Like these people are not worthy of our aid, right? Like they are corrupt over there. That narrative is persistent, right? That Puerto Ricans are something else. That Puerto Rico is something else. It's not really us. It's not us, the mainland. It's not us Americans. And so, we don't have to respond in the same way. And the stark example, of course, is Hurricane Harvey, which happened right before Hurricane Maria. And I live in Texas, I have family in Houston. And even though it is still true that there are communities in Houston, especially, poor Black and Brown communities, that have not gotten the aid that they should have gotten immediately, right? There was much quicker action in Houston and in Florida than there was in Puerto Rico. And that was stark. People could see it, right? But the underlying kind of logic is, well, Puerto Rico, it's not really the US. So, we don't have to respond in the same way. It's like nice of us to respond, right? Like we're good people, so we should send them aid. But we don't have to because they're not really us. And that's a logic that persists. And I would argue that Downs is part of that, right? It instrumentalizes what's already kind of a part of a logic, of a racist logic towards a common sense towards the Caribbean, towards Puerto Rico.
That'll bring me to one more question, but before we get there, I have to, of course, ask my favorite question of all of the podcast episodes. What are some of your favorite examples of the way that this history of Puerto Rico and the law show up in popular culture?
Thank you. I've been thinking a lot about this question. um, there's so many great examples, especially in the last post Maria, of work that's really thinking about like what Maria was, what Puerto Rico was experiencing, right? The debt crisis before, and what's happening now. So your question about the law in particular, it's hard to kind of for me to say this is explicitly sort of grappling with law, right? But what is true of Puerto Rico is that all of these dynamics are undergirded by this law, right? And that's the argument that I make is that Downs is in absolutely everything, whether we know what Downs is or not. It's touching absolutely every aspect of the way that life is lived in Puerto Rico. So the pop culture art piece that I've most recently read that I keep coming back to is a novel called Velorio by an author, Xavier Navarro Aquino. And it came out like 2021, I think. And it's this beautiful, beautiful story of post Maria Puerto Rico. He talks in an interview about how the opening scene, the opening kind of chapter is of a young girl whose sister dies in their home due to a mudslide. And because of their disconnection, they're up in the mountains. They have to live with her body in their house for weeks before aid can come, right? Or they can bury her. And so that's the first chapter of the novel. And he has said that that is actually based on events that happened, right? On a family who had a very similar experience. So it's this like devastating, but also and somewhat magical realityist, however you say that, story, but that is also very much grounded in the truth of what many families experienced in Maria and right after. And it tells like these stories of many different characters who are sort of like moving to converge on this group that's led by this he's like a cult leader who has this notion, and his name is Urayoan, and Urayoan famously is one of the caciques in Puerto Rico, right? Or like indigenous leaders during the Spanish colonial period. And but he has this idea that he's going to build a new society, and he calls it utopia, right? So it's going to be this like utopic. And of course, it quickly devolves into this kind of fascistic, like somewhat savage society, right? But it's this beautiful sort of telling of all of these stories, and I think what he does is really sort of try to paint a picture of the way that Maria impacted many different people, even while it's sort of playing in this kind of brutal, dictator-like figure. So that's a novel that I loved, and I just recently taught a chapter of it to my students, which is why it's like very fresh in my mind. But I also really love there's a lot of great poetry that has come out of Puerto Rico in the last, I mean, Debt Crisis and Maria, right, in the past like 10, 15 years, that is just sort of really, really, you know, taking on the sort of power, right? And really like speaking to the corruption and the corruption of power in Puerto Rico, both like on the Puerto Rico government level and the U.S. level, right? And also speaking to trauma post Maria, and to hope, right? Speaking to hope and to beauty, and to the possibilities even within this difficult society. So, um, yeah, I read a lot of poetry, and that gives me a lot of faith.
I have not read that novel, so I'll definitely be sure to check it out myself, but also link it for our listeners if you're interested in reading as well. So, my final question of the episode, we've talked a lot about this colonial history, and sort of the developments that have gone on post Downs, particularly, right? What do you think the sort of decolonial future of Puerto Rico looks like? I think, especially amidst conversations about decolonization, there are obviously been discussions about certain islands who are independent becoming republics, if they haven't already. And I think just, this ongoing dichotomy, as we've talked about the law, race, and US exceptionalism in a sense, pertaining to Puerto Rico and its growth and development. What are sort of your hopes for the future of Puerto Rico and even just its relationship to the rest of the Caribbean as well?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I recently participated in, or I guess I'm still technically participating in a study group with the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, all around at Hunter College, that's focused on decolonization. And so I've spent the last year or so working with a group of artists, scholars, journalists, and really thinking about this question. Um, and what I take hope from, or what I think is really uplifting, and especially in looking at examples from other islands in the Caribbean and even in the Pacific, is one that the conversation continues and is urgent and loud, right? I think whenever sometimes people who don't come from either former colonies or places that continue to be colonized, they really think that colonialism is no more, right? So it's just like colonialism, what? That ended. What are we talking about, right? So I love that the conversation is very present and it's still very active and is very vocal. Um, and I think that's important, right? Because battle number one is battling erasure, right? And battling forgetfulness. And then I take a lot of hope too from young activists, especially in Puerto Rico, the way that they're articulating sovereignty and decolonization, which I think we have been for so long kind of stuck in notions of political sovereignty and political decolonization. Um, and yes, decolonization takes many shapes and many phases and many sort of, yeah, many shapes, right? So I think there is the conversation around what kind of political nation or political entity sovereignty decolonization means for Puerto Rico. And then there's the question of what kind of lives do people want to live, which I think is the most pressing one, and the one that people, I think, are more directly contending with. And I see much more hope in that because I think we're so mired in the question, especially in Puerto Rico, right, under the kind of rubrics of what's possible seem very limited. We can either be a state, we can either be a free and independent nation, or we can be whatever we are now, maybe better, a commonwealth, a maybe better commonwealth, or just a shitty commonwealth or whatever, but this is it, right? And those conversations are so difficult and protracted and stagnant in some ways, that what I find a lot of hope in is people turning away from those conversations in Puerto Rico and saying, like, you know what, those conversations do not serve us. We have real concerns, right? Our concerns are, do we have proper food sovereignty? Do we have, access to land? Do people have access to clean water? How do we create the communities that we want to see and build our own sort of community based answers to some of these problems? That can't be everything, unfortunately, because there are, powerful actors that will continue to sort of impede that kind of community level sovereignty, if we want to call it that. But I still think that that's worth fighting for, right? That I think it's worth kind of reinvesting in community and collectively working as community. And I see that happening in Puerto Rico, all over Puerto Rico. And I think that's really, really, really powerful, you know? I don't have the answers to the big structural, right? I'm still grappling with them, you know? I know what I want in my heart, but, is it possible? Like, is independence possible for Puerto Rico? I don't know what that would look like. It would require us really, really considering, like, how do we feed ourselves, right? One, I mean, I think what Maria most explicitly showed us is that, Puerto Rico is absolutely reliant on imported food. And so, how do we feed ourselves is a very important question, right? And in a very, climate change impacted area, how do we survive, right? How do we have clean water? And those are all questions that are radically urgent. So what I am heartened by is that people in community are trying to answer those questions. They're trying to resist the sort of larger forces as well, but also saying like, yes, we have to figure out we would like a change to our political status. And yes, that is important, but also we need clean water and food and to survive. So I think that's beautiful and I'm heartened by it. And I will continue to sort of, support those efforts and also push for something better, push for the beautiful place that Puerto Ricans deserve, right? The sort of ability to decide for themselves that we all deserve and to make the future that we want to see.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Dr. Jimenez, for joining me for this episode, for sharing a bit about your book and your work. And again, I really want to push our listeners to definitely check out Making Never Neverland, Race and Law in the Creation of Puerto Rico when it's out in June. I will add our link in the show notes so you can definitely pre-order it in advance. Thank you again, Dr. Jimenez. And for our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Licklemore. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.